was a quiet, unsettling night at a major international airport in the United States, a time when the last of the day's flights had long since departed, and only a few travelers remained in the terminals. The dim lights cast long shadows across the empty spaces, and the echo of footsteps seemed unusually loud against the silence. It was the kind of night that made even the most seasoned travelers feel uneasy. One such traveler, a woman named Jessica, was making her way to her gate for a late-night flight to New York City. Jessica had been at the airport for a few hours, waiting for her delayed flight. The gate she was at had only a few scattered passengers, and most of them were either engrossed in their phones or sleeping with their heads resting on their arms. She found a seat near the windows, hoping to pass the time by looking out at the runway. But soon, she began to feel a strange sense of discomfort. As she glanced around the waiting area, her eyes fell on a man sitting alone, his hands folded on his lap. His posture was straight and formal, but there was something about him that made her feel uneasy. He was elderly, wearing an old-fashioned suit, his face partially obscured by a large, wide-brimmed hat. He hadn't moved in what seemed like hours, his eyes fixed straight ahead, not acknowledging anyone or anything around him. His stillness was almost unnatural, like a mannequin in a store window. The other passengers didn't seem to notice him at all, which only made the situation feel even stranger. But Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She tried to focus on her phone to distract herself, but her gaze kept returning to the man. The air around him seemed unnaturally still, like a bubble that no one dared to break. As the minutes ticked by, Jessica couldn't ignore the feeling of dread growing in her chest. It wasn't just that the man wasn't moving, it was the sensation that he wasn't there at all. She stood up and casually moved closer to where the man was seated, hoping to get a better look at him without appearing too obvious. As she neared him, she couldn't help but notice how pale and lifeless his skin looked under the fluorescent lights, and how his clothes, though neat, seemed almost out of place, old-fashioned, even. His suit looked like something from decades ago, with the kind of cut and fabric that hadn't been in style for years. Feeling a sense of urgency, Jessica walked over to the gate agent, who was seated behind a counter a few feet away. She asked if anyone knew who the elderly man sitting near the windows was. The agent, a young woman in her 20s, looked at Jessica with a puzzled expression. "What elderly man?" she asked, glancing around the area. Jessica turned, her heart pounding in her chest, only to find that the man was no longer seated where he had been. She scanned the area, confused, but there was no sign of him anywhere. The seats were empty now, except for a few passengers quietly waiting for their flights. The man had vanished into thin air, as if he had never existed. Jessica's confusion turned to a creeping sense of dread. She returned to the gate agent and explained that she had seen the man just moments before. But the agent insisted that there had been no one fitting that description in the terminal that evening. "I've been working here all night," the agent said, her tone apologetic. "Are you sure you're not just tired or imagining things?" But Jessica knew she wasn't imagining things. There was something real about that man, something unsettling and wrong. She made her way back to her seat, hoping to shake off the feeling, but she couldn't. The image of the man, sitting so still and unblinking, lingered in her mind. It was as if his presence had left an indelible mark on the air itself. As her flight was finally called, Jessica gathered her things and made her way to the gate. The entire time, her mind raced. Could it have been a ghost? The idea seemed absurd, but the more she thought about it, the more she couldn't dismiss it. She recalled the stories she had heard over the years, of ghostly apparitions haunting airports and train stations, of travelers encountering figures from another time who were stuck between the living world and the afterlife. Later that evening, as she boarded the plane and found her seat, Jessica couldn't help but overhear the conversation between two fellow passengers. They were talking about a similar encounter they had heard of, a strange man who had been seen sitting at the same airport in the same spot for weeks. No one knew who he was or where he had come from. Some claimed to have seen him over the years, always at the same gate, never moving, never speaking. The woman seated next to her glanced at Jessica and smiled knowingly. "That's the story of the midnight passenger," she said in a hushed voice. "They say he's been waiting for a flight that never comes. Some think he's a ghost. Others believe he's trapped here in some way, unable to leave. But no one really knows for sure." Jessica felt a chill run down her spine as she listened to the woman's words. Could it be true? Was the man she had seen the same one that others had reported over the years? The thought that she might have encountered a ghostly figure in the quiet corner of an airport was enough to make her shiver. To this day, Jessica hasn't been able to shake the memory of the midnight passenger. The man she saw or didn't see that night remains a mystery. Was he simply an elderly traveler lost in time, or was he something far darker? Whatever the case may be, Jessica knows one thing for sure. The airport, with its sterile walls and bright lights, hides far more than just travelers. It's a place where spirits can linger, waiting for a flight that will never take off. And for Jessica, every time she steps foot in an airport, she wonders, is the midnight passenger still out there, watching, waiting? It was supposed to be an ordinary flight. Daniel, a young man from California, had just finished a business trip in the city and was eager to get home after a long and exhausting few days. He had boarded the red-eye flight late in the evening, a routine he had grown accustomed to. He was used to the exhaustion of travel, long hours spent in airports, waiting in lines, and the uncomfortable sleep on airplanes. But tonight, something felt different. As he boarded the flight, Daniel noticed something odd. The plane was nearly full, but there were still a few empty seats scattered throughout the cabin. He found his assigned seat and settled in, placing his carry-on bag in the overhead compartment before slipping into his seat by the window. The lights in the cabin dimmed as the flight attendants made their final rounds, ensuring everyone was settled and ready for takeoff. The hum of the engines filled the air, and soon enough they were airborne. It wasn't long into the flight before Daniel noticed something unusual. The seat next to him, which had been vacant when he first sat down, was now occupied. A man, dressed in a flight attendant uniform, had appeared out of nowhere and seated himself beside Daniel. The man was tall and thin, with sharp features and dark, piercing eyes. His uniform was immaculate, the crisp white shirt and navy blue tie perfectly in place, and his dark hair was neatly combed. First, Daniel thought nothing of it. The flight attendants were always moving around the cabin, assisting passengers, and it wasn't uncommon for them to sit in vacant seats during quieter moments. However, as the flight progressed, Daniel began to feel a strange unease. The man didn't speak to anyone, not even to Daniel. He simply sat there, staring ahead, his hands folded in his lap. Every so often, he would glance around the cabin, but there was no warmth in his gaze, just a cold, blank stare. Daniel tried to shake off the feeling of discomfort, but it lingered. He glanced around the cabin, hoping to catch the attention of one of the flight attendants, but none of them seemed to notice the man. In fact, none of them seemed to acknowledge him at all. It was as if he wasn't even there. Every time Daniel looked back to the seat next to him, the man was still sitting perfectly still, his hands neatly placed in his lap, his eyes locked ahead. Feeling uneasy, Daniel decided to ask one of the flight attendants about the man. He stood up and walked to the galley, where two attendants were preparing drinks for the passengers. "Excuse me," Daniel began, trying to remain calm. "There's someone sitting next to me, but he doesn't seem like one of the crew members. He's dressed in a uniform, but he's not helping out. Is there a mistake?" The flight attendant, a young woman with a friendly smile, looked at him in confusion. "Who?" she asked, glancing around the cabin. "We've only got the regular crew on board tonight. Are you sure you're not mistaken?" Daniel felt his heart race. He turned to look back at his seat, but when he looked, the man in the uniform was gone. The seat was empty again, just like it had been when he first boarded the plane. He was left standing in the aisle, staring at the now vacant seat, his mind racing. The flight attendant, seeing his confusion, walked with him back to his seat. They arrived to find the seat empty, just as it had been earlier. Daniel tried to explain that the man had been sitting there just moments ago, but the attendant seemed skeptical. "There's no one else in that seat, sir," she said, her voice calm but unsure. "Maybe you were just tired." The flight can be disorienting sometimes, especially after a long day, but Daniel was certain. He had seen the man. He could still picture him clearly in his mind. The flight attendant, sensing Daniel's distress, gave him a reassuring smile before returning to her duties. But the unease lingered, and Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The flight continued uneventfully, but the strange occurrence remained at the back of Daniel's mind. When the plane finally began its descent into the airport, he couldn't help but glance around nervously, half expecting to see the mysterious man again. But there was no sign of him. As the plane touched down and the passengers began to disembark, Daniel thought it was finally over. The bizarre encounter would just remain as a strange, unsettling memory. But little did he know the mystery was far from over. A few weeks later, Daniel was telling the story to a colleague at work. His colleague, Sarah, had a strange expression on her face as she listened. "That sounds a lot like the story I heard about Gate 32, she said. "You know, the stowaway?" Daniel raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Sarah leaned in, lowering her voice. "There's a rumor that goes around the airport about a mysterious flight attendant who appears on certain flights. People claim that he's never listed as part of the crew, that no one really knows who he is, and that he only appears on certain flights, always in the same seat. Some people believe he's a ghost, that he's somehow stuck in the world of the living, unable to leave. There are even reports of passengers having the same experience you had, seeing him sitting next to them, only for him to disappear when they look away." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. He had never heard anything like it before, but it sent a chill down his spine. Could the man he had encountered be part of some strange, paranormal phenomenon? Or was there something else at play? The more he thought about it, the more it seemed like the man in the uniform was no ordinary flight attendant. To this day, Daniel has never been able to explain what happened on that flight. He still wonders about the man in the flight attendant uniform and the eerie feeling that had settled over him. Was it just a trick of the mind, a result of exhaustion from his long trip? Or was there something darker at play, something that couldn't be explained by logic or reason? Every time Daniel boards a plane, he wonders, will the stowaway of Gate 32 appear again, or will his unsettling presence continue to haunt the corridors of the airport, waiting for the next unsuspecting passenger? It was supposed to be a quick layover, just a few hours in a mid-sized airport before catching the connecting flight to his final destination. Nathan, a businessman traveling for a conference, had been flying all day, tired and ready to get some rest before the next leg of his journey. He was grateful when he saw a quiet corner near the boarding gate. The terminal was nearly empty, with only a few other passengers scattered around. So he decided to find a seat, plug in his headphones, and catch up on emails while waiting. As he settled into the seat, something about the terminal seemed off. The air felt stale, like it hadn't been properly ventilated for hours. The overhead lights flickered slightly, casting long shadows across the nearly deserted space. Nathan shrugged it off. Maybe it was just the exhaustion of the long day of travel, but there was a strange sense of unease that he couldn't shake. He tried to distract himself with his phone, tapping away at emails and looking through social media, but the unease kept creeping back. Every time he looked up, the terminal seemed more deserted, even though people were still present. The few travelers who were there looked strange to him, as if they were caught in their own worlds, moving in slow motion. One passenger, an older man sitting across the room, kept glancing in Nathan's direction. Every time Nathan looked at him, the man's eyes were locked on him, unblinking, as though he were waiting for something. It made Nathan feel uncomfortable, but he tried to ignore it, thinking it was just his fatigue playing tricks on him. Time dragged on, and as the minutes passed, Nathan began to notice something even more unsettling. The older man, who had been sitting quietly, now seemed to be getting closer, slowly shuffling toward him without ever taking his eyes off of him. The more Nathan looked at the man, the more he realized something was wrong. The man's movements were unnatural, stiff, as though he was being pulled by invisible strings. His face, too, seemed slightly off. A strange grayish pallor to his skin, his lips tight, and his eyes wide open with a look that was almost too intense, too deliberate. Nathan's heart began to race. He tried to get up and move to a different seat, but his legs felt heavy, as if the air had turned thick and oppressive. Every step he tried to take felt sluggish, as though something was holding him back, and his body refused to respond. He looked around at the few other passengers in the terminal, hoping someone might help or notice his distress, but they seemed completely oblivious. It was as though they were in a trance, their eyes glazed, not even acknowledging him as he struggled to stand. The older man, now much closer, was staring directly at him, his mouth slightly open, as if he was about to say something, but no sound came. Instead, the terminal around Nathan seemed to warp, as if the world itself was bending. The walls stretched, and the lights flickered more intensely. A sudden chill filled the air, making Nathan shiver despite the warmth of the terminal. Everything felt wrong, like a dream that he couldn't wake up from, or worse, a nightmare that was slowly becoming real. Desperate to break free, Nathan looked for an exit, but every door seemed to lead him in circles, always bringing him back to the same seat by the gate. It was as if the terminal itself was a maze, trapping him in a loop with no escape. His mind raced, but the terror only deepened. The older man was getting closer, now just a few feet away, still staring at him with those unblinking, wide eyes. Finally, Nathan mustered all the strength he had left and bolted from his seat. He ran toward the nearest gate, desperate for anything to break the oppressive atmosphere. As he passed the rows of chairs, the other passengers' eyes followed him, but not with concern. Rather, with an eerie, vacant look that chilled him to the bone. He reached the gate, but to his horror, the door wouldn't open. He tugged at the handle, pulling with all his might, but it was as though the door was locked from the inside, refusing to give him any way out. A sound suddenly echoed through the terminal, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Nathan spun around, and his eyes locked onto the older man, who was now standing just behind him. The man's face was inches from Nathan's, but his mouth was moving in a grotesque way, as though the muscles in his face were contorting against their will. Nathan could see his lips forming words, but no sound came out, just a deep, unnatural growl. The man's eyes were bulging, wide with an intensity that felt as though they were drilling into Nathan's soul. Terrified, Nathan stepped back, only to feel his legs buckle beneath him, as if some invisible force was pulling him to the ground. He fell to his knees, his body trembling uncontrollably. As the growl grew louder, the entire terminal seemed to distort, the walls bending inward and the lights flickering in rapid succession. It felt as though the very building itself was alive, breathing in and out, trapping him in a nightmare from which he couldn't escape. Suddenly, everything went still. The terminal was silent, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted, as though the world had snapped back into focus. Nathan blinked, confused and disoriented. The older man was gone. The passengers were all seated in their original positions, appearing as if nothing had happened. The lights overhead were back to normal, and the terminal seemed as it should be, quiet, mundane, and empty. Shaken, Nathan slowly stood up, unsure if he had just experienced a terrifying hallucination or something far more sinister. He looked around, half expecting the older man to reappear, but there was nothing, just an ordinary, quiet terminal with a few passengers waiting for their flights. His heart was still racing, and he couldn't shake the sense that he had narrowly escaped something far worse than he could ever imagine. As the time for his next flight drew closer, Nathan couldn't help but feel the weight of the layover pressing on him. He glanced nervously at the boarding gate, still unsure if what he had experienced was real or just a product of exhaustion. But deep down, he knew one thing for sure. Something was terribly wrong with that airport, and he would never look at a layover the same way again. From that night on, every time Nathan had a layover, he couldn't help but glance nervously at the corners of the terminal, wondering if he would ever encounter the strange, haunting presence of the older man again. Would he be trapped once more in that distorted, twisted version of reality? Or had he narrowly escaped something far worse than he could comprehend?